You're back in with Northwestern Outdoors Radio. I'm John Cruz. We've got some news to share from the Columbia River, and if you're a commercial angler, you're going to like this. If you're a recreational angler or a conservationist, maybe not so much. Last year, the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission, working with their counterparts in Oregon, delayed promised reforms from 2014 that were supposed to get gillnets off the main stem of the Columbia River. This year, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Director Kelly Sussewind and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Director Kurt Melcher announced allocations that not only keep gillnets in the Columbia, but in some cases increase the amount of time they're going to be in there. For the Spring Chinook fishery, recreation anglers are going to get 75% of the catch, which is actually 5% more than last year. Gillnetters will get 25% of the catch. There is a big difference here, though. According to the Coastal Conservation Association in Washington, they will be putting gillnets not only in off-channel areas, but in the main stem of the Columbia for the first time since 2016 for the spring fishery. The summer Chinook run will see an 80-20 split between recreational and commercial anglers, and gillnets will not be allowed in the main stem of the river. As for the fall Chinook, the allocations will be the same as last year, a 70-30 split, and gillnets will be allowed again during the fall salmon fishery upstream of the Lewis River on the lower Columbia. Finally, we are seeing another change regarding barbless hooks. They were not required prior to 2014 on the Columbia for salmon and steelhead. But when gillnet reforms were enacted, barbless hooks became a requirement. That requirement was lifted last year, but now it is being returned this year. With us here to answer some questions about all this is Bill Tweit. He's a special assistant with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Bill, thanks for coming on the air.
Thanks for having me, John.
So, Bill, we're just going to start off right here. Gillnets, as we both know, are non-selective. If you catch an ESA-protected salmon or steelhead in a gillnet, you can't exactly let it go and expect it to survive. That's the reason why both states came together back in 2014 with the goal of getting gillnets out of the river, at least the main stem, by 2019. Why are we not doing this?
We're continuing to work towards that objective, John, and we are not actually putting gillnets back on the river in the spring. We have left open the possibility of a tanglenet fishery in the spring. Tanglenets are actually mark selective. They allow fishermen to return unmarked fish. It works better for large-bodied fish like Chinook, but they allow them to return those fish back to the water either right away if they're lively or after recovering in a recovery box. And the scientific studies that we've done, as well as Canadians and others who also put tanglenets to use, indicates that the survival rate of those released fish from tanglenets is only a few percentage points lower than the survival rate from hooked and released by recreational fishers. So pretty comparable in terms of the ability to release unmarked fish out of a tanglenet, different than a gillnet. Yes, in the fall, the two directors' agreement, and I should stress, by the way, that this is just for 2020. The agreement that the two directors reached for the fall is to continue the use of large mesh gillnets, large mesh meaning either 8 or 9 inch stretch, which allows steelhead to pass through, but are effective at catching Chinook. They're not a mark-selective gear, though. We use them only in an area where there are substantial harvestable wild fish, and that's upstream of the Lewis. So they're targeting mostly that Hanford Reach, upriver bright fishery. And just remind folks that most recreational fisheries on those upriver brights are also not mark selective because they're harvestable wild fish. It's a healthy run of fish, and anglers don't need to be releasing those wild fish.
Getting back to these tanglenets, Bill, I've got a question. The whole objective back in 2014 was to transition the gillnet fleet over to operations where they could net fish in other ways that were selective, like these tanglenets. Why don't we just have the commercial anglers just use tanglenets and get done with the gillnets? That's been the intent for 6 years now.
It has, and it has been frustrating for staff how slowly the development of alternative gears has gone. We initially gave ourselves 5 years to get from initial development to implementation, and unfortunately, we've fallen way short of that. There's a variety of reasons. We have put in a lot of effort, and particularly on seines. The problem that we ended up with seines was Our current estimate of mortality rates of released fish is higher than we ever expected, and we couldn't ever really find a way to avoid enough steelhead to make it workable as well. And, you've got two things going on when you're trying to manage around wild fish. One is the encounter rate of them, and then secondly is the mortality rate. And both of those have turned out to be higher. We're continuing to look for ways to address that, but in the meantime, they stymie us. We are pretty excited about the pound net. We didn't have the funding to develop the pound net. We used up most of our funding on seine evaluation. The jury's still out, but the initial mortality rates look promising. Unfortunately, the very first site they chose to install it is actually a site that's always known for steelhead passage. So we're getting an opportunity to kind of work out how to have that gear avoid steelhead, but continuing to work with that. Still hopeful that ultimately that'll be at least one workable tool, and we're not giving up on seines either, trying to reevaluate the mortality rate numbers in particular. But it's definitely taken us a lot longer than we projected, and that's frustrating to us. We still think that ultimately that's the long-term solution for harvesting large numbers of hatchery fish before they get back to the spawning areas and pose problems for us by having too many hatchery fish on the spawning areas. We think that having first a series of recreational fisheries and then a cleanup commercial fishery is still the formula to do that. So we're still motivated to get there, but it's definitely not played out the way we'd initially hoped.
Need to ask a question about politics and timing. Now, according to CCA Washington State was really behind the push to open the door for gillnets on the main stem of the Columbia in the spring. Understand that may not happen and that tangle nets are the preferred method, but that's what they're saying. And last year, when the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission delayed rollbacks, there was a lot of pushback from conservation organizations. There was a lot of pushback from recreational anglers who contacted their legislatures, and you're now facing a $26 million shortfall. There's some that would say, myself included, that from a timing point of view, you're shooting yourself in the foot by repeating the same mistake again.
So we needed guidance for this year, and last year's guidance was ambiguous in whether it was a year or multiple years, but it also clearly triggered a negative reaction. So we needed new guidance. And again, we adopted in this year's two directors agreement everything that's in the Oregon rule. So Oregon wasn't going to move any further. That's what's in their long-term rule, is what we agreed to. Again, to be clear, this agreement does not allow gillnets in the spring. It specifically says if there's a spring main stem fishery, which frankly is
right. May or may not happen based on the runs.
It has to be tangle net. So the only gillnet opportunity that this agreement provides is the fall large mesh, similar to last year, and again, identical to what's in Oregon's permanent rule. I think the way it's being painted is very different than what's actually in the agreement. And I think folks will come to, as they have a chance to really study it, certainly legislators and others will come to recognize that. For this year, we're not expecting a big Spring Chinook run. There's not a lot of harvest. It's not going to be a banner Spring Chinook year.
We've got to move on because we're getting too deep in the weeds and we're running out of time. But I do have one last question for you here, and that is this curious flip-flop on barbless hooks. Prior to 2014, they were not required. In 2014, they became required. Last year, they were again not required. And I was told on this show that the science had changed and that it wasn't that big of a deal. And yet, this year, we're going back to barbless hooks. You're going to start getting a credibility issue as an agency when it comes to this. If you keep flip-flopping, why are we flip-flopping?
First off, let me just tell you, staff is pretty upset about that as well. We recognize it's difficult to maintain a consistent message when we flip-flop like this. The commission ended up deciding, and then our director with that backing, that the long-term approach still should be barbless hooks. I recognize they went the other way a year ago, but after reevaluating that and thinking about the basic approach with barbless hooks is a precautionary approach. The science will give you contradictory answers depending upon how the study was conducted. Barbless hooks either help or they really don't help. But what we do know is that as part of doing everything we can to ensure that the fish that are being released with as little mortality as possible. Barbless hooks are part of a precautionary approach to that. That's where a commission is settled. That's where a director is settled. And as staff, we fervently hope that's where it stays, because we get that the flip-flopping is really eroding our credibility.
It is. Unfortunately, it is. However, I will say this, Bill. This has not been an easy interview. You fielded a lot of hard questions, and you've put things in a different perspective for me and probably for some of our listeners as well. We've got to go, but I want to thank you for taking the time to address all these issues today regarding the Columbia River and the fish we all love on Northwestern Outdoors Radio.
Thanks for the opportunity, John.
Ready for more local fishing and hunting? You got it. It's the Pacific Northwest edition of America Outdoors Radio, right here on Seattle's Sports Radio 950 KJR.
During the opening segment of our program today, we talked about gillnets and other commercial netting on the Columbia River. With us here to give us another perspective about this issue is Nello Picinich. He is the Executive Director of the Coastal Conservation Association. Nello, great to have you back on the air.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me, and good morning.
So, Nello, in response to this announcement by Oregon and Washington, your organization issued a press release sounding the alarm, telling people they need to contact state legislators in Washington State because this decision opens the door to gillnets going on the main stem of the Columbia in the spring and possibly all year long, which completely goes against an earlier joint agreement by both Oregon and Washington to get gillnets off the river. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife says this isn't true. We're working to get gillnets off the river. It's just taking us more time than expected, and we're not putting gillnets in the spring. The only nets we'll put in, if we put in any nets at all, are tangle nets that can be used by commercial anglers. What do you say to that?
Well, just for a clarification, John, a tangle net is a gillnet. You know, you can put a fancier word on it, but it still is the same thing. It's a small mesh gillnet. And just to make a quick point, gillnetting, if you look in our bylaws, RCWs, and WACs, is the only way that you can commercially fish without some kind of emergent fisheries permit. They don't have to have that for tangle nets. So by default, a tangle net is a gillnet by legal definition. So it's small mesh. And I'll just tell you, John, the problem with small mesh gillnets in the spring is twofold. If they go in too early, they do gill and kill steelhead. And so that is the problem early. Later on in the season, when tangle small mesh gillnets go in, they intercept a whole bunch of shad. And this is well documented. Commercial guys will complain about how many shad they get. So yes, while it conceivably could work in the perfect scenario, there is no perfect scenario, as we know in mixed stock fisheries. Because of the significant amount of bycatch, they are not selective.
All right. We only have another 30 seconds, but you are asking folks to contact legislators throughout the state of Washington. What do you want them to say?
I want them to vent their frustration, to let them know that conservation and recreational fishing needs to be a priority like was originally agreed to in this plan years ago. And we need our legislators involved to help turn the tide.
If you want to find out more about this issue, go to www.ccawashington.org. Go to the Action Center. You'll find all the information from CCA's perspective about this. You should also go ahead and check out our Facebook page at America Outdoors Radio and Northwestern Outdoors Radio. Listen to the conversation we had with Bill Tweit from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Make up your mind and decide what you want to do. Nello, thanks for sharing this with us today.
Thank you, John.